minutes. Hello to everyone who has joined. We are just waiting for a few more participants, and we'll be getting started in the next minute or so. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning or good evening to all who are joining, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brigitte Schukert, and I am a research associate at the Stimson Center and the managing editor for South Asian Voices, an online platform that features analysis of the security, politics, and economics of the subcontinent. I am delighted to be joined this morning by a fantastic panel to discuss a multifaceted and complicated issue of disinformation in global affairs and crisis escalation. Perhaps the most pivotal global challenges of the past decade has been the sheer speed at which information travels in a world that is increasingly online and increasingly on social media. While this in many ways presents exciting opportunities across a variety of sectors, the risks of manipulated information, misinformation, and disinformation have only become more abundantly clear in recent years. From the role of disinformation and misinformation in domestic polarization in the United States, to Vladimir Putin's recent baseless claims of a denazification campaign prior to the invasion of Ukraine, it has become increasingly clear that disinformation will be a challenge that states, media, and civil society will have to contend with for years to come. This is a topic that we could discuss all day, although we just have an hour this morning, but I am thrilled to be joined by a fantastic panel who I'm sure will have a fascinating conversation on the ways that disinformation may impact potential crisis escalation in South Asia. Joining me this morning, we have independent academic analyst, Dr. Salma Shaheen, whose recent piece on disinformation and vulnerabilities for Pakistan can be read on South Asian Voices. We also have with us this morning, Sylvia Mishra, a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center South Asia program, as well as the Jane Nolan Nuclear Security Fellow at the Truman Center and a new tech nuclear officer at the European Leadership Network. Finally, we also have Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. You can read his analysis on disinformation and misinformation following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, also on South Asian Voices. For our audience, we will be integrating questions throughout the discussion this morning, so please do use the Q&A box if any questions arise, and I will try to get to as many as we can in the hour that we have this morning. This will also be live streamed and available on the Stimson website as well as South Asian Voices later today, if you want to look back on the conversation. So handing it over now to our panelists to ground the themes of disinformation and ways that it might impact a crisis. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to start by imagining a crisis scenario in South Asia where disinformation might matter. To start, I'll begin with Salma, and then I'll hand it over to Michael, followed by Sylvia.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me, yeah? Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Brigitte, for your questions. And thank you, first of all, you and Stimson for giving me this opportunity here. So with regards to your question, I guess if I go to the history, if I read through the history of the South Asian crisis between India and Pakistan after nuclearization, there has always been an event by a non-state actor triggering a interstate crisis between the two nuclear armed states. That has been the pattern so far. So there is also a pattern that there is a false flag operations, either conducted by a state, yeah, and just building on upon that operation and building into a crisis. So I'm thinking here a little bit loud here is that for me, false flag military operation is a disinformation campaign with a militarized character. So you're conducting you're orchestrating a campaign, a military action, and with a false flag, you're hiding your own identity in a way that the accountability or the responsibility should be put on another, or the blame should be put on another. So in a way, it is a kind of a disinformation that a state might be doing it. So there has been an accusations on India that India is carrying false flag operations in past. So that could be a one scenario in future as well, where any non-state actor event could be used as a either as a false flag operation or in a genuine way, a crisis that can trigger a crisis between two states. So within that crisis, where this disinformation will come in, it could come in, again, learning from the history, the disinformation can be about the surgical strikes or the military reprisals we have seen in the past after the Uri attack in 2016. So we need to see that, what are the aims and how the disinformation actually works for both countries, for India and Pakistan. So for India, disinformation works or maybe is required to an extent to satisfy the domestic outrage at the government's numbness towards Pakistan. So they have to satisfy their domestic public. For Pakistan, disinformation or providing a lack of information about any event, for example, a surgical strike has happened or not happened. So you're restricting the information and public domain that is required to build its reputation at regional and international level. That being a reputation of being a mature crisis handler and a mature nuclear armed state, which is seen as a condition on Pakistan that they have to show themselves like this. And there has been a lack of information also for Pakistan, because not to give public an opinion or give public or face any public reaction that you have to take certain action against India. So the aims for both countries are different to use disinformation in that context. So for me, it could be another non-state actor or non-state actor even in genuine form, or it could be a false flag operation itself as a disinformation campaign between India and Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Salma. I think you raised a number of themes that we'll hopefully be able to return to throughout the discussion. I'll hand it over to Michael now, and then at the end we can open it back up for further discussion as well.
Well, thanks, Brigitte. One scenario that comes to mind right away involves an internal crisis in a South Asian country where there are serious communal tensions, and someone posts a message on Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp claiming falsely that a certain group has carried out some type of atrocity, burning down homes, attacking a religious facility, carrying out a lynching. And then this fake news goes viral on social media, and it prompts angry people to take to the streets and attack those belonging to the group falsely accused of the initial provocation. And this is, of course, something that has happened. This is not hypothetical. It's happened certainly in India with fake allegations against Indian Muslims. It's also happened in Sri Lanka in recent years to varying degrees. And then just one more potential scenario to highlight, this one being an interstate one. And I think that I agree with Dr. Salma that thinking about the India-Pakistan context is critical. But imagine that India-Pakistan relations are in a state of high tension, at a moment when there's a high risk of a military conflict. So, let's say that Pakistani terrorists have carried out a major attack in India. India has retaliated with limited cross-border airstrikes to take out terrorist targets. And then there's unease about the possibilities of escalation to conflict. And then at that point, a fake story emerges about a provocation by one of the countries against the other, a provocation that could risk escalation to the point of conflict. Now, again, there's a precedent here. I'm sure everyone in this audience would remember the Balakot crisis in 2019. What happened at one point is that a prominent Pakistani TV journalist with about 500,000 followers on Twitter posted on Twitter that there were reports of Indian submarine movement toward Karachi and that the Pakistani Air Force was performing surveillance. This may have been misinformation. This may have been a case of the person not knowing whether the reports were true or not. At any rate, it went viral on social media. And fortunately, as I recall, the Pakistani military issued a statement at some point saying that there was no such movement. And so problems were averted, fortunately. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, over to Sylvia.
Thanks, Brigida. I think it's really wonderful that the Stimson Center is hosting this conversation. This is clearly a topic that has gained a lot of attention and traction, but very concerted efforts to do a serious study on the aspects of disinformation and the ramification and its impact on decision making is something that is entirely understudied. And it is great that the Stimson Center is creating these conversations around these very significant topics. I just wanted to take a step back and really appreciate all the points that both Salma and Michael brought to the table. But I think it's important to just first acknowledge and appreciate the challenge that this entire issue of disinformation really creates, and especially amongst nuclear armed states during a crisis or moment, and that is something for us to really think about, that even though disinformation and aspects of information manipulation has always been part of statecraft that like almost since the height of the Cold War and that we know of, but what has really made a difference in the past couple of years is the emergence of social media. And because different social media platforms do not have a uniform effect in terms of relaying the information that is being consumed by a wide and large audience, I think the effects for different crises is very different, and that's why it really becomes difficult for governments to probably have a more cogent and coherent one strategy or a kind of whole of government approach towards addressing this challenge of disinformation. And which really brings me to this point that you asked us to envision a scenario. Now, so many of the emerging and disruptive technologies are like mutating and evolving at such a rapid pace. I'm fascinated by the generative adversarial networks or machine learning technology, and the fact that a deep fake video of, for example, a South Asian leader resorting to using, for example, nuclear weapons really might inject a lot of crisis escalation and deliberate crisis escalation in a scenario. So I'm fascinated by some of these technologies that are still evolving. We do not know the full effect of such technologies, but really understand the ramifications of such technologies would have a lot of bearing on national security policies and posturing in the South Asian context. And I just wanted to specifically highlight 2 points that the impact of such technologies probably might have on decision making. Is it really begs the question about how the volume of information and the pace and velocity of the spread of information really creates a sense of ambiguity and thickens the fog of war. And in a crisis, I think that is something that might really undermine trust between already adversaries who are interlocked in years of conflict. And after really increasing the and thickening the fog of war, I think the other point of concern, especially in the South Asian context, is how do then political leaders manage crises, and especially what happens when nuclear deterrence breaks. And that is where I think the role of social media, especially since 2006, when South Asian countries were introduced to platforms like Facebook and Twitter, really has been grappling with this entire idea of one, how do you demystify factual information, and like really not get caught in the thickening and fog of war. And second is, how do you manage crises, especially to prevent a breakdown of nuclear deterrence. I'll stop there, and I look forward to more discussion on this.
Thank you to all of you. I think each of these responses really hit on some of the reasons that this is such a complex topic, and could see just the scope of different scenarios and kind of possible instances where disinformation or as well as misinformation, so information that doesn't necessarily have the purpose to be deceptive, but is perhaps incorrectly picked up, and the variety, I think, of actors or sources that this could potentially come from. And before moving on to individual questions for each of you, I just wanted to see if any of you had a response or wanted to add any further thoughts to factors that perhaps make disinformation or misinformation most salient and most dangerous. Certainly a theme, I think, in the scenario responses were decision-making in times of crisis that shapes how false reports are received or picked up, whether on social media or elsewhere. I wanted to just open it for any further thoughts, and then we'll move on to additional questions.
Brigitte, I just quickly wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. I know we often use it in one sentence, but I think it is important to flag out and underscore the difference. As in, misinformation is information that is incorrect, but disinformation, which really poses a challenge in terms of interstate crisis, is because disinformation is the deliberate act of pushing incorrect information, and it very well could be like state actors, governments themselves pushing out these incorrect information so as to maneuver and gain a certain political objective. So I think when it comes to the challenge of how do we address misinformation, or for that matter disinformation, I think the process is very different, and especially so in terms and in times of crises, how governments engage with the aspect and challenge of disinformation is probably going to be very different from handling a misinformation scenario.
And Michael, I'll hand it over to you. And thank you, Sylvia. I think that's an important delineation to make, as these terms are often grouped together and used side by side. So thank you.
Yeah, just two quick points. One is that I think that there's a particularly concerning type of information that I would describe as content that appears suspicious, but it has not or cannot be conclusively confirmed as false. Or at least not quickly. So it sort of falls somewhere in sort of the continuum of true information, misinformation, disinformation. It's sort of a gray area. And this can be very tricky. In other words, something that you may think is false, but you can't confirm that quickly. And thinking about another scenario here, if you want to sort of broaden the scope of definitions of security, let's say Pakistan's experiencing serious water shortages. crippling water shortages, and then someone claims that India is engaging in serious cases of water theft, where it's preventing water from flowing downstream. It's hard to prove, right? It's hard to know right away if that's happening. It's hard to know if something is happening, but it's in line with the Indus Waters Treaty, if India is allowed to do that, so to speak. And that uncertainty can sort of add to tensions between the two. The other point I would make is that I think that Sylvia, I think, made this point just earlier, but I would foot stomp it. South Asia, I think, conditions there provide a perfect storm for disinformation being so tough to combat, because you have, on the one hand, deep internet and broader technological penetration throughout the region, the upsurge in social media use in recent years, but that's combined with a lack of media literacy. And I think Dr. Salma addressed this in her essay. And that means an inability to critically examine information online and know whether what's being seen on social media is true or not. And not being able to make that decision right away or make that case, that could make things more difficult as well.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think all excellent points. And Dr. Shaheen, you certainly do address in your essay the multiple ways that South Asia presents a challenging at times environment for addressing misinformation and disinformation. But I'll hand it over to you next for comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight obviously we are talking about the disinformation, so there's a lot of talk about this. But I also want to point out that, when you are actually holding an information about a specific crisis or event, I would just refer to this recent Indian accidental missile launch into Pakistan. It occurred, as per the reports, as the media reported, it occurred on 9th of March, but it became public, the event became public on 11th of March. Yeah. So within these 2 days, what happened and why the information was not made in public, why even the information was not shared among the states. So such kind of events can happen in future, and when you are actually holding information to yourself, you are actually creating a lot of vacuum where a lot of disinformation can come in and fill that gap. So for states, I guess there's a need to, they need to come up clear what happened. And we have seen this in case of surgical strikes. In 2016, India claimed that it carried out a surgical strike, although the information was not clearly given on what kind of military operation has been taken or what kind of weapons have been used, whereas Pakistan completely denied it. In 2019, we saw that India claimed that, okay, we carried out a surgical attack on a terrorist, on a biggest terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan. Whereas on Pakistani side, they've said that the strike just killed 2 or 3 trees, maybe. So this kind of information that comes, that's a misinformation. But the real concern that happened in this missile launch is that when you're holding key information to yourself and you're creating a lot of room for disinformation, for misinformation, for fake news to come in. Thank you.
I wanted to take a moment to also raise an audience question for Dr. Fiza Batul, one of our former visiting fellows. So the question Fiza raised was exploring the ways that governments have sought to address disinformation. And Dr. Shaheen, I know this comes up as well in your piece, but thinking through the ways that, while on the one hand, there is a challenge and a vulnerability to disinformation and crisis escalation, there is also the question of what measures governments may take to reportedly crack down on fake news, disinformation or misinformation that can come forward as laws that are restrictive on civil society, press freedoms, et cetera. So I would just open this kind of question up to our panel of kind of exploring the sort of other side of this, but how does the role of state regulation and involvement come into play, particularly looking at South Asia? Salma, I'm not sure if you'd like to take this question first, since this is something that you've also discussed in your piece, but also we'll open it up to everyone on the panel.
Okay, yeah. That's an interesting point, yeah. for example, if I go from the constitutional point of view, there is an Article 19 of the Constitution that clearly says that you have a freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, and everything. But within that clause, there is a reasonable restrictions as well, that you are allowed to have certain freedom of expression, but state has a right to put on certain reasonable restrictions. And I'll read that out clearly, that freedom of press or expression subject to any reasonable restrictions imposed by law in the interest of the glory of Islam or the integrity, security, or defense of Pakistan, or any part thereof friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or in relation to the conduct of court, or incitement to an offense. Now having these reasonable restrictions in a law is fine, because they are in the Indian Constitution as well. They are in other countries' constitutions as well. So the point is not with the putting reasonable restrictions in it. The point is that, how do you interpret that? Because while you are not interpreting it, that muddles the whole freedom of expression and national interest so deeply that it is very difficult for governments to draw a line, or at least create a balance between the two, between the freedom of expression and to counter disinformation. So what actually the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and European Convention says that these reasonable restrictions are fine to be in your law, but they have to comply, or they have to meet three requirements. First, the restrictions must be clearly set out in law, which most of the time are not, actually. And restrictions must genuinely be for the purpose of protecting national security and must have the demonstrable effect of protecting that aim. Third, the restrictions must be necessary. And there has to be, and there is another that, whatever the punishment you are actually including in your law against these, if these restrictions or if these laws are broken, they should be proportionate. So what happened in Pakistan, that there have been certain laws and certain rules or laws that are enacted, but in a way, those laws have given a lot of or unchecked powers to government to control or to curb any dissenting voice, to control or curb political opposition. So that's the major criticism that is coming on the government of Pakistan. Now, this recent government, who is the coalition government, who came in March, and they actually voted and they actually promised to review these laws, and they ensure that we will be ensuring the freedom of speech. But the point is that, one of the law, which is the PICA law, that was enacted in 2016 when the PMLN government was in the power. So we have to see that, how they are going to review all this. But this is a challenge that I guess every other state is facing, that you have to enact the laws, you have to keep in the reasonable restrictions as well, and you have to ensure the freedom of expression as well. So, but one, I will be focusing here as well, or I'll be pointing out here this thing that, if we go through the freedom of index of past 3 or 4 years, Pakistan's score or ranking has fallen consistently from 2018 onwards. And so is the India. Pakistan's ranking in 2018 was 139 in that freedom of press index. And in 2022, it is 157 out of 180 countries. So that shows that, how much stifling these laws have been in country. I will end here.
Thank you. And I will hand it over to Sylvia next.
I thought it was a very interesting question from Fiza, and I think Salma really brought to the table a very interesting points. This is something that both Michael and Salma has mentioned about the importance of media literacy. And I think it would be important to underscore that information and media literacy is just not an educational issue right now, but I think it has really assumed the importance and become a national security imperative. And I think like really a whole of government approach should be adopted in terms of advancing greater media literacy and really starting out from young children for them to become more responsible netizens. That is one. Second, I think to this entire question about what are some of the policies that national governments can adopt in terms of preventing disinformation. I think definitely that is an idea that needs to be tailored to different countries, but it is also important to kind of situate it in the broader debate of really discussing whether should governments really regulate social media, or there should be some kind of balancing between social media corporations making those companies more transparent. And I think like the point is not lost on us about the fact that government regulation of social media corporation might not be desirable or either feasible, but for that matter, to what degree and extent social media corporations can be more transparent is an ongoing debate that clearly requires more attention and education. There is the Aspen Commission information which really underscores a lot of efforts that are being suggested to governments and social media corporations to incorporate greater transparency in terms of social media corporations, especially during crises. I think that is one important way to kind of advance and prevent disinformation information. And then the second, I think, especially in the context of South Asian countries, it is important for both like China, India, Pakistan, but especially India and Pakistan, because China has a very different approach to this, especially for both India and Pakistan. They should adopt and learn lessons from countries like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Some of these countries I mentioned, they have been really frontline in terms of Russian disinformation campaigns, and each countries have really tailored their preventing disinformation strategies according to their own national goals and objectives and need. And I think adopting some of the lessons learned and best practices from there is a useful example. And I'm also reminded about the active measures working group that the United States advanced during the height of the Cold War, especially in the 1970s and 80s, which really rallied diplomats, spies, and a whole network of different multi-agency to combat KGB's false information. And we don't have something like that to an extent, but clearly the Indian government has been taking several proactive measures. There's a recently newly created Directorate General of Information Warfare, which kind of goes to show that the Indian government is taking some of these challenges seriously, but I think like there is room and scope to do much more in order to mitigate some of the challenges of disinformation.
Thank you, Sylvia. And now over to Michael.
Yeah, I really don't have that much to add to that. I agree with those 2 points. Clearly conversations around disinformation are global conversations. They're happening far beyond South Asia. And the issue of government regulation of information is a very politicized and sensitive issue, because there will always be a concern that well-intentioned efforts to remove disinformation will inevitably be used to crack down on dissent and to police speech more broadly. Just here in the US, a few weeks ago, the Homeland Security Department established a new disinformation governance board. It was meant to coordinate efforts by different agencies to combat disinformation, but it was suspended recently after just about 3 weeks of being in operation. The director of it was getting death threats, wasn't going very well. And that's because a lot of people thought it was meant to police speech. So it's very difficult, even in a country like the United States, very difficult to deal with these issues. Very, very sensitive.
Thank you all, and certainly something that is being difficult to grapple with globally. The next question, also from audience and similar to a question from the team as well, that is in a similar focus area. And I think Michael also gets back to your initial scenario in the beginning, thinking through internal crises dynamics. So recently have seen in times of crisis, for instance, Sri Lanka restricting social media during periods of social unrest. How effective are those at curbing misinformation as they are intended to do? And what are the implications of actions like this in the future? So I'll open it up first to if anyone has any initial comments. I think some of our earlier discussion hinted at some of this. But thinking, I think yeah, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, I mean, on Sri Lanka, Michael might be a good person to talk about, but I'll just highlight that about this breakdown or restricting the internet services or the mobile services during certain events. In Pakistan, we have seen this, and there has been episodes, especially during the protests, for example, the TLP protests, where state, or even during the religious events during the Muharram, when the Shia has their own religious events to conduct a religious event. So there has always been a security risk in Pakistan. So based on that, government actually, as a policy, government actually restrict mobile services or control mobile services in some areas, maybe internet services as well, to ensure security. And because we need to see this in a context, because there has been Pakistan has been under the global war on terror, fighting the global war on terror, where it's deemed reasonable to, at least, because whenever there is a larger gathering, either it's a protest, or a political protest, or a religious protest, or a religious festival, or a celebration, or an event going on. So they deemed it feasible that we need to restrict it to a certain extent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen. If there are no further comments on this question, wanted to highlight another audience question that we received, and that's, what is the role of regional language content in spreading disinformation or misinformation, and what are potential response options or different challenges that this presents?
Sorry if I got it correctly. The question is about the regional languages, the use of.
Yeah, so I think languages other than, recent reports that have come out recently, for example, have been kind of a lack of resources dedicated by social media outlets to curbing disinformation or misinformation in languages other than English, and potential different challenges that the spread of misinformation or disinformation in.
Yeah. I think, from my personal, I can give an anecdotal reference to it. During the 2019 Pulwama Balakot crisis, I actually analyzed the tweets on the both sides of Indian and Pakistani parliamentarian tweets, and I wrote about that as well. So I analyzed that, and the benefit, obviously, probably we get it that it's the Hindi and Urdu are similar whenever we write in Roman English, so I can get that. Yeah, some of the tweets I did find which were written in Hindi, and I translated it using, there is an option that you can translate it in English. I did that, so I got the message, and obviously you can relate it that what kind of hashtags are used, so you can relate it. I'm not, I can't actually read the Hindi dialect. I can't read that, but I can understand that as well. So that is quite. That will be a challenging for the one who doesn't know it. But as far as the translation goes with the of the Twitter, that was. I can't say that it was 100% correct, but it gave the gist. It gave the idea that what was the tweet about. But having said that, I think, I mean, for example, if I'm using a Twitter, I use it in English as well. I use Roman English sometimes, and I use Urdu as well. So it depends that whom you are communicating to. People do get an idea, and for obvious reasons, obviously you don't understand all the languages of the region. Even I don't understand all the Pakistani languages, so that could be a barrier. But then obviously if I'm writing in, for example, my vernacular language in Punjabi, if I'm writing, so obviously I know that who is the audience, who is my audience. So you are definitely targeting at that. Thank you.
I just wanted to take a moment and appreciate a great audience question. I think the role of vernaculars and really perpetuating disinformation is something that is just adds another layer of challenge. And I think over here, the NGOs and regional NGOs and fact-checking organizations have a very important role to play. And I think especially during peace times and ahead of crisis, I think it's important for central government and also state governments to really create a body and a network of groups of fact checkers, peer review NGOs that can play a vital role in terms of really translating and fact checking tweets in different vernaculars. I think especially for a country like India, that is an important and a big challenge because of the diverse languages, but I think closer coordination amongst the central state government, NGOs, and also social media corporation is very important to kind of address this issue, but clearly makes this entire challenge of disinformation and adds more complexity really as in how one is trying to prevent and curb disinformation.
Thank you both. Michael, did you have a thought to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of regional languages, I can't, this goes directly to the issue of disinformation, but, clearly you have some groups, political leaders, as well as civil society organizations like the Pashtun Tahfuz movement in Pakistan that will have different messages depending on what language they're using. You notice that there tends to be, in many cases when English is used, I'm referring here specifically to the PTM in Pakistan, the language is not as harsh, it's not as sharp when in English, and then when they're speaking in Pashto, there tends to be much sharper language directed at opponents and so forth. I'm not saying there's disinformation here or there, but clearly, languages are used strategically to target a particular audience. And I would argue you could say that with the Taliban, you have similar cases in effect here. The Taliban in Afghanistan, every statement they issue in English sounds great. It sounds like they're the most peaceful, fun-loving, responsible entity in the world. But then, when there are interviews they have with local press, different Pashto languages, other languages, it could be a very different story. So I think that, the Taliban likes to project itself to the world, e.g. in English, as this, remarkably different group from how it was previously in the 1990s. It does that in English, but again, that's in English. The context can be very different when local vernacular languages are used by the group.
I just quickly wanted to respond and whilst listening to Michael, it also occurred to me, especially because there can also be existing tensions between state governments and the central government, right? And I just wanted to reflect on the fact that if in certain crises the political objectives and end goals are not seen as unified, I think even state government leaders can exploit that. And once again, I think there is something to be discussed and probably studied about the what disinformation can also create in terms of accentuating lack of internal cohesion. And I think that is something that it just occurred to me when Michael was speaking, because what is really interpreted in the English language can sound very different. For example, in Bengal, where I come from, and the fact that there are different state governments and their objectives can be extremely different from the central government. It can also be a potential cause of perpetuating disinformation.
And Dr. Salma, did you have a note as well?
I just have a quick point to make. I mean, when you're the point that Michael made, actually, when Taliban actually giving the interview in English, that's different tone or different. But it also depends on the domestic, when they are in their own saying something in their own language in their domestic constituency, then it depends on the audience, who the audience are. And obviously for domestic consumption, you may be using certain rhetorics, certain messages or certain phrases to communicate your audience. It's just an example occurred to my mind that recently, because of this political opposition that is in Pakistan right now, when Imran Khan's government was ousted in March. So they before that, there was a lot of rhetoric going on in public domains, in speeches between the different political opposition parties. So one of the word, I'm not actually using that word here, but one of the word actually used by a minister at that time, which has dual meanings. If you say it in Urdu, that means a widow. But if you say it in Punjabi, that means an abuse. So that's how these languages work. And he was so confident, and he came on the television and he justified his use of that word, even in an abusive way, but he justified that. So that's how the languages work, and that's how you can manipulate words and phrases to convey your message. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for the fantastic audience question. We opened up a really interesting discussion. Switching gears a little bit in the time we have left, one thing that has come up in our discussion is the Balakot crisis as sort of a case study for looking at the ways that social media may play a role in crisis escalation, whether that's in misinformation or disinformation, or simply by a lot of information traveling very quickly in new forms. So I wanted to just ask the panel, as Balakot is frequently referenced as the case study to examine these aspects, what has changed in the past 3 years that are new things that observers should be watching, whether that's emerging technologies or changes in the media space that observers should be paying attention to? I may call on Sylvia first, as I know that you have done a fair amount of work on emerging technologies and escalation and decision-making.
Sure, thanks. I think that's a good question. I think one of the things, especially in the South Asian context, we should be mindful about is the fact that after almost 2 decades, both India and Pakistan are really moving away from a state of recessed deterrence, which means their like strategic weapons are increasingly in the future going to be more operational, as in how you put nuclear weapons at sea for both the countries, and because there's been a sense of like crisis stability over several for the last 2 decades, and the fact that the questions on operational readiness is something that one should be mindful of. It is important to think about off-ramps, and disinformation can really cause major challenges and obstacles and frustrate off-ramp efforts, because with the spread of disinformation, I think what it really does is undermines government's trust in each other, and therefore I think the challenge of off-ramps during the crisis is something that one should be more mindful of, and both India and Pakistan should tailor strategies in terms of crisis communications. That is one. Second, I think both the countries should really be careful about the advancements in the generative adversarial networks, machine learning, and deep fakes. Being responsive in terms of looking at some of the vulnerabilities in the cyberspace is something that both the countries should be paying attention to. And then the third point is, I think the idea of disinformation, one can argue, is to essentially create uncertainties. And as we know, famously shelling, deterrence also requires bolstering ambiguity. But in terms of countries like India and Pakistan, which have such shorter flight times, there could be really chances of inadvertent escalation, miscalculation, and accidental warfare. And that is something that both the countries should be really mindful of. And during ahead of crises, I think it is imperative for both the countries to prepare for such contingencies, which really reduces the chances of any kind of inadvertent escalation due to propagation of disinformation, and also minimize nuclear risk in the region, which is really so susceptible to some of the gravest nuclear dangers.
I can quickly weigh in on that. If we're trying to look for a good news story here, because this is a pretty depressing discussion, as it has to be. If you look at what's changed since the Balakot crisis in the India-Pakistan context, I think that there was last year a truce, a border truce that was signed by the two countries, which has reduced tensions to a degree. So the relationship is nowhere near as tense as it was in 2019. So I think that does mean perhaps that the risks of disinformation leading to escalation or greater tensions between the two are less great, just because the broader relationship is in a better place than it had been, back in 2019.
Yeah, I just want to go back to my point that I made earlier, that one of the indicators that if we want to analyze the role of media in both India and Pakistan, we need to see that how far the media freedom of media is there. So if you go back to the freedom of media index, both India and Pakistan have dropped their score, dropped the score, and their ranking worsened from, if I go back again from 2018 to 2020, both have worsened, both India and Pakistan. India was 138 in 2018. In 2022, it was 150. Pakistan was in 2018 139. In 2022, Pakistan was at 157 out of 180. So that shows that how what is the condition or a state of affairs in both countries. There's a one study that was published by Atlantic Council researcher, and that study actually observed the evolving landscape of media in both India and Pakistan from 2018 to 2020. And they conducted some field interviews of journalists as well. So one of the Pakistani journalists, they quoted his words in the paper, in the study, and I'm just paraphrasing that. I'm just remembering what was quoted. The journalist said that with regards to the role of media and diplomacy, they said that we are not open, we are not allowed to cover the events as it is. So the diplomacy is being prioritized over the authentic journalism. So the lines are being fed to the journalists that this is the line, and based on this line, you have to, start, or you have to write a new story. Because of the, obviously there is an economic stifling as well, and socio-political stifling as well. So based on that, the government is stifling reality to fit a favored context. So that is happening in Pakistan, and the same other state of affairs are in India. And even if we see, there is another international index about the freedom of Net, which is the Freedom House, where they conduct an annual survey and analyzes the internet freedom across different countries. So according to the latest survey, Pakistan was categorized as partially free. And Pakistan was categorized among the 55 countries where government authorities investigated, arrested, or even convicted people for their social media content posts. So these are the state of affairs from 2019 to till today. I do agree with Michael's viewpoint that there have been a ceasefire truce last year, which is a positive indication. But as far as the disinformation or information point of view, both countries need to have a certain level of freedom of media to at least report on what's happening around, because they have, and this is not just happening in 2022 or from the. I did study the Kargil crisis as well in 1999. In that, during that crisis, even this there was a regular Indian military briefings to journalists on daily basis. That's the briefing, and now take out of it and report on it. I'm not seeing any change since then. I mean, the way the things are there. Journalists have been arrested, journalists have been convicted, journalists have been picked up by I don't know whom, by different agencies. So till the time the media is not free, we are not getting a good picture, or if not a true picture, but at least a good picture of what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Open for any final thoughts on that question before our last question to wrap up. So thinking back to scenarios in the beginning or the conversation that we've had over this past hour, are there any possible confidence building measures or CBMs that could be used ahead of future crisis scenarios in South Asia that might be related to disinformation or misinformation, to think forward towards the future as we wrap up this conversation? Yes, go ahead.
I can go. Sure. I mean, clearly the best way to reduce the chances of a crisis fueled by disinformation is to reduce disinformation itself. And we've discussed how difficult that is. Clearly the issue of media literacy has to be addressed. And I think that ideally there would be better quality control in the traditional media as well, to ensure that fake stories aren't aired. And this does happen, particularly in some of the major Indian TV channels. And I think in the case of Afghanistan, which I covered in my essay, it's really important to diversify information sources beyond social media because of the state of the media environment in Afghanistan post-Taliban takeover. There's not enough on-the-ground reportage. Too much content is popping up on social media. A lot of it is fake. And so what I suggest in the essay is to put together a list of organizations that focus on media issues in Afghanistan and are willing to privately share access to their sources on the ground who are willing to provide information anonymously. Of course, there's still plenty of journalists in Afghanistan, foreign as well as Afghan, but not as much as you'd like, not as much as necessary. In terms of CBMs, very briefly, I think, to state the obvious, it's important that channels and hotlines between governments and ideally militaries in rival states, i.e. India and Pakistan, be kept open so that they can trade notes about relevant cases of misinformation and disinformation and aim to dispel them before the risk of escalation sets in. This would also be important, quite frankly, with Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan, given that we've had a few cases in recent weeks of Pakistan launching airstrikes in Afghanistan to target Pakistani Taliban militants, has not gone down well with the Taliban. And yet there's also been a lot of misinformation and disinformation online since the Taliban takeover, with claims that Pakistani drones have been flying over Panjshir and other cases of Pakistani military operations that have been proven wrong. Islamabad and the Taliban regime don't have formal relations, but given their history, their ties are clearly good enough for them to set up these channels to try to ensure that disinformation doesn't spark greater tensions. I'll end there.
Thank you, Michael. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Given the fact that the Stimson Center is always a great place and a harbinger of really advancing creative and good ideas, which are also actionable for both the Indian and the Pakistani governments to advance in terms of confidence building measure. Here's one added to the list. I think it might be possible for both the Indian and the Pakistani government to establish a high level joint study about the role and impact of media, both traditional and social media, in terms of crisis escalation, which can really dovetail into a training a program slash platform for leading journalists from both the countries who can also advance people to people connection, but also really understand what are some of the key vulnerabilities that both countries envision when it comes to the impact and role of media in crisis escalation.
Yeah. I broadly agree with Michael and Sylvia said. One thing we need to know, we need to keep in mind that disinformation is a part of the hybrid warfare, which both India and Pakistan are actually embarking on. So they have their own strategies. And any CBM on disinformation would be related to cyber domain. And there's a lot of other things that come in the cyber domain as well. So there, for any CBM, I guess there is a need to resume the dialogue process between India and Pakistan. And I agree with the suggestion of the Sylvia to conduct a joint study. That is a good idea, but at the same time, both states need to build their societies resilient enough to disinformation, and that can be done through education. One of the suggestion that I made in my article is to make the fact-checking exercises more available to even to the younger students in schools and colleges. They have their computer sciences subjects. So within that, there are different games which they can play, which can be included in their syllabus, which they can play, which they can actually operate to see that, how they can actually get into the real facts. So made it because we are in the age where disinformation and information that will be there. It's not going anywhere. And we cannot actually put controls on technology because technological progression will be going on. So all we have to do is we have to adjust ourselves to these new trends. First, build societal resilience through education, and at bilateral level, I guess resume dialogue process. And we had been a people exchange earlier. For example, one of the program that media on both sides started in early 2000s was Aman Ki Asha program, where media outlets initiated that program. Such kind of programs should be resumed, or new programs should come in. But the point is that there should be more and more people exchange, because then even if there's a fake news coming up, fake story, that can be actually checked or counter-checked in that. But before going that, I will just also address highlight two more points that both countries need to address their unresolved disputes first, and they also need to work on to address the deeper divisions that are within the societies in both India and Pakistan. In India is facing this issue as well, and Pakistan is facing the issue of polarization as well. So they need to address that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. We have come to the end of the hour, although as noted in the beginning, these are topics that I think we could sit around all day discussing. This is also a topic that can seem insurmountable at times, as it is a challenge that continues to be pressing. And I really just want to thank our entire panel for thinking creatively through these issues and posing some important recommendations for ways to address these future challenges. So Thank you all, and many thanks to our audience for joining this morning. I also wanted to say thank you to the South Asia Program and South Asian Voices team, Isha Gupta, Dylan Junkia, Nuzair Satar, and Akuti Vasudeva for helping to bring this all together. You can continue this conversation as it will be ongoing on South Asian Voices by reading the analysis on the website at southasianvoices.org or following us on Twitter at South Asian Voices. And the video of this webinar will also be posted later today. So many thanks and have a wonderful rest of your day or good evening for wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you.
Thank you.